Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? This is a soft review of Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose, but it's also about other things. As I'm reading back through my Engines of Liberty books to make sure that I don't screw anything up too big with this sequel that's about to come out, one of the most apparent things is just how much better I've gotten at writing in the last 10 years. I'm fortunate enough on this book to have a good beta reader who he got a few chapters into Howling Wilderness, and I remember him DMing me before he got to all of his notes and stuff, and he's like, "Man, it's almost like you've gotten a little bit better at this than you were at the beginning." He's like, "Yeah, I wrote that first book and published it right before I turned 30. And that was after years and years of going to writing conferences, and I'd had an agent, and I'd been through editing groups dozens of times. And it represented the best work that I could do at the time. And now if I were to go back and write that book from zero, it would be way better than it is. I knew that was going to be the case when I wrote it and when I published it, but I didn't need to wait until I had 30 years of professional experience under my belt. The whole point was to do the best that I could and to get better through doing. I still spent the money to hire editors, and I wrote the best that I could with what I knew how to do at the time. I don't know the exact count of books that I had read at that point in my life. I do remember that in 2016, I read my 1,000th book, at least as far as my Goodreads count goes. Book 1,000 was The Revenant by Michael Punke. I'm pretty sure it's Punke. Since then, I can't remember what book 1,500 was. I'm coming up on 1,900 now. That's one of the advantages of the stats on Goodreads, is just being able to track all of that stuff. I read, on average, about 100 books a year, and that's how I get to that point. But of a special note is that right around the time that I started self-publishing, I also started reading a lot more nonfiction. I had a generally good grasp of American history and a very rudimentary grasp of the significant movements of the Revolutionary period. But I've since read even more books on that particular series of events, as well as the interceding years in American history. And with what I know now, not just about writing, but about history, I would write an alternate history a little bit differently. But since I'm creating a fantasy alternate timeline, I'm bound by what's gone before. And it is what it is. I'm not upset with myself because, again, I know that I did the best that I could at that time. I think in 2017 I read this book, Undaunted Courage, which is a detailed account of the Lewis and Clark expedition in the early 1800s. And the things that I learned from that could go on to color a different telling of an alternate American history, but I'm throwing stronger British imperialism into the mix and magic and all of that stuff. So it's meant to throw you for a hook, to give you a curveball, to change some of the things that you might otherwise expect to be normal. The Lewis and Clark expedition, this was a mapping of the interior of the North American continent. And if all you remember is what you learned from middle school, you just remember that these guys were kind of commissioned by Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, to head inland, map the area, get a good idea of what Native American tribes there were. The whole Louisiana Purchase thing had gone down. It was just to give us an idea of what we had to look forward to, so that when westward expansion happened, all of these homesteaders and ranchers and all of that, like, these groups wouldn't be going into it blind. We bought this thing, let's see what we've got. The expedition was plagued by problems from the get-go. The builders that they had commissioned to put together their boats were weeks, if not months, behind schedule, if I remember right. And to the point where Lewis and Clark and their crew had to jump in and lend a hand with building and finishing these things so that they could get the expedition underway. Their plan was to travel by river at first. Eventually, they would have to do some overland stuff, but transfer as much stuff as they could into the interior of the continent with the boats, and then go from there. Military discipline was the order of the day. They kept the men content with a ration of rum, of alcohol. At the end of the day, it's like, oh yeah, today's sucked, we're tired, we're hungry, but I'll care a little bit less if I'm drunk. But that's the thing about rations, is you've got to ration them. And if you've got anybody who abuses the ration system, they've got to be punished. And there was more than one occasion when guys who were supposed to be on watch to make sure that various tribes of Indians didn't show up to steal their goods, which was a frequent occurrence, they would also tap into one of the kegs of rum, and before you knew it, they got drunk, and getting drunk on watch was a major violation of the discipline that Lewis and Clark were trying to enforce on the expedition. And so guys would have to get lashes. And then the very next day, even though they got lashes, they were supposed to be in the barges rowing with their backs turned into basically mincemeat. Let it serve as a warning that there wasn't going to be any leniency for that kind of crap, that they had to be very strict with their rations and their goods, and they had to conduct themselves in a certain way. One of the many health problems that the men reported, other than scurvy and other things that were a result of malnutrition, was blindness or vision problems. It was generally understood that this was a consequence of them traveling on the water in the wintertime, when the glare from the snow and the surface of the river was very, very bad, that it would damage their eyes. But Ambrose offers up another potential cause for this, and that was that when they met different tribes of Plains Indians, a lot of the men, like the Indian men, would bring their women to the white guys traveling through, and would pimp them out to the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it was in this way that a lot of the expeditioners contracted syphilis, one consequence of which is vision problems. This is just to give you an idea of what 19th century ideas were amongst different groups about the value of interbreeding, and like the power that you could get by having a half-white baby. It's not an idea that people are comfortable thinking about now, but it was an idea that not just the whites had about breeding. I just finished reading Pride and Prejudice today, and that was a novel that concerned itself very much with the gentry and manners and things that were important in early 19th century England, and one of them was the quality of breeding, and they strongly attributed behaviors to your stock, as it were. So much so that when one of the Bennett sisters ran off and eloped with an officer, this was so damning that it would cast aspersions on the other 4 unmarried sisters, and they would pretty much become unmarriageable, because any one of them, coming from the same stock, could be just as randomly and unexpectedly wild as this one that ran off and did a stupid, silly thing. Like, that's what a lot of the third act of the book concerns itself with. I mention all of this because, again, it would probably influence the world building a little bit differently if I had kind of that backdrop for crafting this story. But I'm glad that I didn't have that, because I was able to tell the story that I wanted to tell in the world that I had built. But this is the advantage, and maybe at the same time kind of the disadvantage, of reading as much as I do, especially when it comes to historical fiction. I might not want to try to shoehorn every single thing that I learn into the worlds that I'm building and the storylines that I'm spinning. I guess you've got to learn how to have a judicious hand with all of that. But Stephen Ambrose goes on to tell the rest of the story of the expedition, and paints a very colorful tapestry of what they went through, what they learned, what their hardships were like. I think the thing that impresses me most about the end of the book is just what it was like for Lewis and Clark when they came back, and how they were celebrated, they were heroes, they were celebrities. The results of their expedition were published in the newspapers, and word traveled far and wide. They became popular, and that gave them political clout, whether they sought it or not. And they would end up with governmental appointments as a result of them just being famous enough to have the public's favor, whether they were uh, qualified for the posts that they received or not. And one of them now, I can't remember which one. This is why I need to go back to read the book again. I want to say that it was Lewis. It could be Clark though. See, like I said, one of them suffered severely from depression near the end of his life, to the point that he was regularly in and out of sanitariums and asylums, and even ended up trying to, I'll use the YouTube word, unalive himself with a pistol, and ended up making the attempt and doing so poorly, and it took him a while to become deceased after the fact. This is just one of those instances where a detailed account in a well-researched book gives you a complete picture of somebody that you learned about in the public school system. And I'll just say that it's not that the public school system lied to you. They just kind of highlight the most significant achievements of these people. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led an expedition into the interior of North America. They mapped it, the people, the terrain, the wildlife, the flora and fauna, and all of that, and brought that information back to the main concentration of the country, as it were, in an era where you didn't have search engines, you didn't have digital communication, you didn't even really have radio. This is how they gathered information and dispersed it amongst the masses. And it was a big, expensive, and important undertaking. And they were the first to do it on that scale. They did relevant work, and it's important to recognize the magnitude of their accomplishment, and also see kind of the toll that it took on them. What would you learn from something like that? Well, maybe don't elect celebrities just because they were really good at one thing doesn't mean they need to be the governor of something else. Seems to be a lesson that we're still not learning today. But anyway, I highly recommend Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. It was a really, really good book when I read it. I think I did the audiobook, and I've since purchased a hardcover for my library so that we can do some homeschool stuff with the kids on it. But I recommend you check it out, see what you learn from it. Let me know what you think. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.